Okay, hello everyone. I'm Adam Pearce. I'm a partner in the Denton's Banking and Finance practice in London. Welcome all of you to this, our final fundamentals webinar of spring and summer 2021. In this term of training webinars that we've been running, we've been looking at a range of structuring and intercreditor issues that arise on finance transactions. And in this final session, we're going to be focusing on mechanisms for increasing and extending facilities, which are becoming an increasingly common feature in a range of different types of transaction now. Co-presenting with me today is Joe Barron-Evans, a senior associate in our banking and finance team in London. We send apologies from Simon Middleton, who was originally scheduled to be speaking with Joe and I today, but is currently waylaid on an urgent client matter. Before we begin the presentation, I'll just quickly run through the usual housekeeping points. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A button, and at the end of the presentation, I'll go through these, and Joe and I will do our best to answer any questions that you may send to us in that way. When you leave the webinar today, a short feedback form will pop up, and we'd be very grateful if you could complete that. We do read the feedback that we get, and we try to take the suggestions into account, both in terms of improving the way that we organise these and suggestions for topics for future sessions. And finally, just a reminder that if you'd like to watch a recording of any of our fundamentals training sessions, or to get a copy of the materials that go with them, you can access these from our fundamentals hub. Details of how to log into the hub or to register on it, if you haven't already done so, are on each invitation. And it's been great to see so many of you registering on the site since we set up our fundamentals program last year. And the recording materials from this session should be on the site by the end of this week. Okay, so we split today's session into 4 parts. To start with, Joe is going to briefly summarise the usual mechanics for amending facilities, including for the purposes of increasing the size or the term of the relevant facility. And that will put into context why borrowers are often keen to supplement these basic terms with alternative mechanisms that will make it easier for them to increase or extend after signing the original deal. And we're going to be focusing on 3 of those mechanisms. Firstly, I'm going to cover incremental facilities and accordions, mechanisms to increase the size of a facility. Joe's then going to run through extension mechanics that are used to increase the term of the facility. And then finally, it'll be back to me to look at structural adjustment clauses, which have a much lower profile than the other mechanics we'll be talking about, but are important for lenders to be aware of, as they can potentially be used both to extend and to increase facilities. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Joe now to run through the usual requirements for amending facilities.
Thanks, Adam. Morning, everyone. As Adam said, I'm a senior associate in the banking and finance team here at Denton's. I'm delighted to be joining him for today's session. As he mentioned, I'll be looking first at the background to this talk and considering what usually is needed to amend facilities, and why perhaps this has encouraged the increased use of some of the mechanisms that we'll be looking at in today's session. So on an unsecured bilateral facility between a single borrower and a lender with no guarantors, amendments as fundamental as extending the term or increasing the amount of a facility may be fairly straightforward. Perhaps not just crossing out a number and replacing it with another, as there are also various conditions precedent to consider to implement those kinds of changes. But certainly some of the key considerations of different structures can be largely ignored. On most of our deals, and I'm sure on most of the deals of those joining today's session, the structures tend to be slightly more complex than that. And even what one might assume to be a fairly straightforward amendment to the facility agreement itself can require a bit more thought to avoid some common pitfalls. So, first and foremost, on syndicated transactions which involve a number of lenders, any request to increase or extend the facility would come to the agent first, who would then check the amendments and waivers clause in the facility agreement. And the starting point is usually at least majority lender consent is required, which comprises lenders who make up not less than 2/3 of the total commitments rather than the loans outstanding at that time. Typically, there's then a list of reserved matters where all lender consent would be required. And barring an unusual set of circumstances and some very relaxed credit teams at documentation stage, increasing the commitments or increasing the term would invariably fall within this category, as that follows the LMA recommended form, and there's really rarely any departure from that position for changes of this nature. So immediately, the first headache might arise, as a financial institution with a tiny percentage of the overall commitments may decide its appetite to remain in the deal no longer aligns with that of the other lenders, or may simply become unresponsive for whatever reason, given its low participation in the deal. Equally, the LMA recommended form provides that where the obligation of an administrative agent or party are affected, that administrative party's consent is required as well. It can be an overlook clause and often seen as just boilerplate, but it's worth considering that for an extension, the agency role is also extended and the agent's buy-in will also be required. So there are some variations that have grown up alongside these provisions, which borrowers can push for to avoid being hamstrung by these requirements. And examples on the slide include the snooze you lose clause and the yank the bank clause. And these both originate in leveraged finance transactions and tend to be where they're most commonly found, but they're not exclusive by any means to those markets. So under the snooze you lose clause, the commitments of a lender who doesn't reply in an agreed time period are ignored for the purposes of obtaining consents. Equally, the yank the bank clause allows for a borrower to force a non-consenting lender to transfer its commitment at par to another bank who will agree to the requested amendment. Even for a performing borrower, it's not always straightforward to find a buyer at par, so that can hinder the process. And another common option, which is shown on the slide, is to incorporate a disenfranchisement clause, under which the available commitments of defaulting lenders can be ignored for the purposes of obtaining lender consents. So that's the finance party side. And finally, the agent, after working through all the documents, has worked out exactly who it should listen to for the purposes of agreeing a request for an extension or an increase of the facilities. But then other questions arise. Do all the obligors need to sign, for example? Well, the starting point is that all parties to a facility agreement need to sign, subject to the terms of that facility agreement. So an obligors agent clause would help with that, as it allows for the obligors to appoint the main borrower to act as their agent on any amendments, with the power to bind them as required. However, where those other obligors are guarantors, as is fairly typical, guarantor confirmations should usually also be obtained for these types of amendments. And so in practice, every obligor may well need to sign up in any case. And then there's the issue of CPs. Reopening documents for signing requires a raft of corporate authorizations to be negotiated and agreed, and an increase the amount of the facilities by way of an amendment may well require that new security needs to be taken. And the lenders will want to take legal advice if that position isn't clear cut. And it doesn't stop there. New legal opinions may be required, perhaps across multiple jurisdictions, which all raises costs, raises delays, and ultimately yours and your client's blood pressure. So perhaps it's no surprise that we've seen an emergence of alternative options where facilities can be reshaped and resized, all within the contemplated parameters of the original finance documents, avoiding the need to reopen the documents and negotiations and the complications that come with amending syndicated financings. Adam will now address the first of these in the form of incremental facilities and accordions.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so yeah, incremental facilities and accordions, those two terms are sometimes used rather imprecisely and interchangeably, and I'll come on to explain the difference between the two in a moment. But they both have the same basic purpose, which is to make it easier for the borrower to increase the size of its facility during the facility term. And the main reasons that it makes it easier for a borrower to do that are as follows. Firstly, the borrower doesn't need all lender or even majority lender consent to use the mechanism. The mechanism will usually enable the borrower to bring new lenders into the facility to provide the additional commitments. For example, if there's insufficient appetite among the existing syndicate. No amendment to the facility agreement itself is required. This is just about exercising a hardwired mechanism in the original form of agreement rather than changing the terms of the facility agreement. So it's a much more streamlined process than doing an actual amendment. For example, it won't generally involve delivery of new corporate authorizations, legal opinions, and so on that lenders would typically expect on an amendment. And as Joe's already mentioned, one of the points that lenders usually need to check with their lawyers when amending secured facilities is whether the existing security will remain effective. And that is likely to be a serious consideration if the amendment involves a significant increase to the amount of the facility, and even more so if the desired amendment involves new lenders coming into the syndicate. By contrast, when a borrower exercises an incremental or an accordion option on a secured deal, it's not usually going to be necessary to retake security. Now, I say usually, I mean, we would be comfortable that there would be no need to retake any English law security when exercising one of these mechanisms, assuming it's all been drafted at the outset in the proper way. If there's security under other laws, this would need to be looked at, but generally you'd be looking to ensure that this was all anticipated and covered off at the outset of the deal when the original security was taken, by making sure that the security documents are drafted and perfected in a way that would mean that any use of that incremental or accordion wouldn't require the retake of security. So these are the headline points on why this is useful for borrowers, but a fundamental characteristic is that these uplifts in the facility amount are not committed in any way. So the borrower is not guaranteed to be able to access those additional funds. Now, it may be that for the size of the borrower's business at closing, the lenders wouldn't be comfortable committing to that additional amount at that stage. And so this is an option that could be used sort of as the business grows over the course of the facility. But often it's more about giving flexibility to the borrower. If it doesn't need the extra liquidity at the outset of the transaction, it will want to avoid paying commitment fees on a larger facility, some of which is undrawn, and it will accept the risk that it's not guaranteed to find those willing lenders post signing to agree to provide that extra funding at that later point. The maximum amount that a borrower can increase the facility commitments through an incremental or an accordion is usually set out as a fixed figure. So, 100 million facility with a 20 million accordion. But in the leverage finance world, you do occasionally see a leverage test used instead, so that the permitted amount is sort of tied to a specified multiple of the borrower's EBITDA. So when do these mechanisms typically appear in deals? Well, they're now very common across the span of investment grade, corporate lending, and leverage finance transactions. I mean, any financings really where the borrower group is a sizable trading business. They're perhaps less likely to be appropriate on deals to SPVs funding a specific asset, for example, a real estate finance, although even in that context, you do sometimes get sort of portfolio acquisition deals or sort of hybrid sort of RCF type deals where some kind of expansion mechanism is included there as well. And they are used on both on term facilities and RCFs. Okay, so I keep referring to incrementals and accordions together, but what is the actual difference between them? Put simply, an incremental facility involves the creation of a new separate facility within the terms of the same facility agreement, whereas an accordion, as the name suggests, just involves the stretching out of an existing facility. So in the diagram on the screen there, both mechanisms are increasing the total commitments by the same amount. But in the blue example on the left, that's been done by creating a separate second incremental facility, whereas in the green example on the right, there's still just one facility that's become larger. So when do we tend to see incrementals? When do we see accordions? Well, the LMA introduced some incremental facility drafting into its leverage finance facility agreement about 5 years ago now, and that assumes that any incremental facility will be a term facility rather than an RCF. There isn't any LMA recommended accordion drafting either in its investment grade documents or any of the others. However, our experience is that in some areas of the market, it's still actually more common for these mechanisms to be structured as accordions. So in the kind of larger investment grade deals, for example, our experience is that it would be pretty unusual to see the LMA incremental facility language to be included. It's almost always done as an accordion, whereas in the leverage finance market or on other transactions that sort of probably tend to use that LMA leveraged agreement as a starting point for documentation, it would be more common to see the incremental facility. And I think one of the reasons that the leverage market has tended to use that separate incremental approach is that it can be a bit cleaner if with the incremental going in as a separate facility, where you already have kind of multiple term facilities or sort of tranches of term debt at the outset of the transaction, so sort of A, B, C, etc. It might be slightly odd to apply an accordion just to one of those existing tranches, whereas in the investment grade market, you don't tend to get that kind of tranching. So you might just have a single RCF facility within your documentation, and you just be stretching that out by using an accordion. But subject to that point, does it actually make any difference how this is structured? If you've got a single term facility or a single RCF, and the parties want this sort of increase feature, does it make any difference which you use? And probably in a big picture way, it doesn't make a big difference. They ultimately do have the same commercial effect, but they do raise slightly different structuring points that need to be addressed in the drafting in slightly different ways, depending on whether you've got an incremental or an accordion. So with an incremental facility, the question arises as whether there should be any limits on the terms of any separate incremental facility that the borrower requests, because generally the existing lenders are not going to want a potentially different group of lenders being paid higher margins or being repaid before them. So you'll usually see some express restrictions around this, and that LMA leverage language covers these 2 points by the incorporation of sort of aggregate yield on the pricing and aggregate life on the repayment points by using those 2 terms. By contrast, with an accordion, by definition, the new commitments created are going to be within the existing facility, and so they're going to be on the same terms unless something bespoke was drafted to move away from that. And so there's less of a need to actively address this point about new commitments coming on separate terms. Another structural difference between the two relates to drawing levels across a specific facility. So it's a fairly fundamental principle of syndicated lending that lenders within a specific facility should all contribute to each advance under that facility pro rata to their respective commitments, and they should receive any payments pro rata to their respective commitments as well. And in that way, at any time, each lender's respective exposure under that facility should be sort of consistent based across the respective commitments they have under that facility. Now, if you look at the facility in green on the right-hand side of the screen, assume that at the point the accordion is exercised, the day one total commitments are fully drawn, and the borrower then exercises the accordion. Now, if all the existing syndicate agree to participate in the accordion in the same proportions as their existing commitments, then there's no issue. Each will still have the same sort of proportion of drawn and undrawn commitments. But if you only have some of the existing syndicate participating in the accordion, or you have a mixture of existing syndicate and new lenders coming into the syndicate, you're not going to have that same balance of drawn and undrawn commitments for each lender within that facility. So there could be an existing lender that's not participating in the accordion that has a fully drawn commitment, and a new lender that is participating that has a fully undrawn commitment. Now, if the borrower then draws down the full accordion amount straight away, then that issue sort of goes away straight away. But with an accordion, you often will see a mechanism where, to address this point, where on the completion of an accordion process, all the loans are sort of effectively deemed to be repaid and then immediately redrawn from the expanded syndicate. And that's a sort of a cash neutral exercise for the borrower, but it means the existing lenders are then contributing a bit less than they were before, and the new lenders more, so that they've got that kind of that consistent balance of drawn and undrawn commitments. These issues don't arise in the same way on incremental facilities, because you've got a separate, completely separate facility in place. So in the example in blue on the left-hand side, there isn't any particular sort of structural issue having the day one facility fully drawn, and then a new incremental facility that is undrawn and then becomes drawn over a period of time once the incremental facility is being put in place. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the process for putting an incremental or accordion into place. And we can go back to sort of lumping incrementals and accordions together again for this purpose, because the process is pretty similar for both of them, subject to use of slightly different terminology. So moving from left to right across the screen, so this is describe the main steps on the process, where it starts with the borrower identifying which lenders are going to contribute to the new commitments that it wants. And I'm going to come on in a moment to explain how that process works. But parking that just for a moment, the idea is that when the borrower comes to deliver a formal notice to the agent stating that it wishes to exercise the mechanic, it will already have the willing lenders lined up and their respective new commitments all allocated. Now, once the borrower delivers that formal notice, each participating lender in the new commitments will then sign a separate sort of two-pager addressed to the agent and the borrower, confirming that it's taking on that additional commitment. And if that involves any new lenders, signing that confirmation will also have the effect of drawing them into the agreement, making them a party to the facility agreement as a lender. So in the context of the LMA incremental facility mechanics, these letters that the sort of participating lenders sign are called incremental facility lender certificates, but different terminology is used for accordion, so they might be called the accordion increase confirmations. They're still sort of basically structured in the same way and have the same purpose. Either way, the templates both for the notice that the borrower is sending to the agent saying this is what the incremental or the accordion that I'm proposing to put in place, and those kind of confirmations that the participating lenders sign, the forms of those are going to be scheduled to the existing facility agreement. So there's no bespoke drafting or negotiation going on here. This is just about filling in the blanks to set out what the size is, who the participating parties are, and how much each are taking. And once those two documents have been completed, there'll need to be KYC on any new lenders that are coming in. And then really sort of the final formal step is that the agent will countersign either the borrower notice or all of the lender confirmations. Again, slight variation between sort of accordions and incremental sometimes on this, but it's a bit like with a transfer certificate when lenders are selling their commitments. The agent countersigning sort of formalizes the end of the process, and it is that sort of marker for the new commitments to be able to come into effect. Excuse me. One further pretty standard condition is that both at the point the borrower delivers the notice to the agent and on the date the mechanism takes effect, that there will be no event of default or potentially no default, and the repeating reps are all true, as shown at the bottom of the screen there. And so you can see that's similar to the conditions that apply when a borrower draws down a loan, and you need those to be true when they request the loan and on the proposed utilisation date. Just one final point on the process, which I've touched on just in that box at the top of the screen there. There is usually a limit to the number of times that a borrower can go through this process over the time of the facility. So, if a borrower has 100 million incremental or accordion, the agent and the existing lenders are not going to want to go through this process sort of 10 times over a 3-year period, as the borrower increases its facility by 10 million at a time. So that's normally covered off in some way in the terms set out in the facility agreement. Okay, final point from me on incrementals and accordions is the one I touched on briefly just now, which is the process for how the borrower puts together its group of lenders that will be providing the additional commitments. So what lenders generally look for is the process shown at the top of the screen. And under that process, the borrower has to approach all the existing lenders first, ask if they want to contribute and how much. If there's then a shortfall on what the borrower has requested, the borrower then goes back to the willing existing lenders and gives them an opportunity to top up their commitments, so that all the additional commitments that the borrower wants are taken by the existing syndicate. And only then at that point will there be an opportunity for the borrower to bring in new lenders not currently within the syndicate if there's still a shortfall. Occasionally you might see an accordion option on a club deal where there isn't even an option to go external, but I think that would be unusual, certainly on any truly sort of syndicated transaction. A slight variation on this process is sort of just missing out the top up option in the middle, which is the sort of the middle option on the screen there. But the main sort of substantive alternative approach is for there to be no obligation on the borrower at all to go to the existing syndicate first. It can choose to go to some or all of the existing syndicate, or just go entirely external straight away. And you can see that from a borrower perspective, if it knows that there's a third-party entity out there willing to provide all of that additional funding that's not currently a lender, being able to go straight to that entity and sort of pull their funding into the existing deal can make it a very quick and streamlined process. So when do we tend to see the different options that are for sort of putting the new lender group together? The option at the top of going to the existing lenders first is probably the more common option. It would tend to be really in the really big syndicated deals with very strong borrowers that you might see the borrower successfully being able to negotiate a right to go external immediately. And part of the reason that existing lenders will want to be asked first is a relationship point. There's also the point around sort of dilution of voting states, and that's particularly relevant on a club deal. So if you've only got sort of 2, 3, 4 lenders in a club, and one of those has got a 35% commitment, I mean, that's a blocking state for sort of decision-making purposes. And the lender with that state wouldn't want to find that another lender is taking on another increased commitment that reduces its commitment down to below 33 1/3 without even being asked about whether it wants to contribute to the increase. And final point, what about eligibility criteria for new lenders coming in? The LMA incremental facility drafting has very loose eligibility criteria here. I mean, it provides that the borrower can bring in any eligible institution, but despite the use of the word institution, this really just means any entity other than an affiliate of the borrower. In the investment grade accordion world, it's a bit more common to have eligibility criteria that are more substantive. So you might be looking at something that sort of that makes it more open for other sort of financial institutions. There might be a minimum credit rating and so on. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Joe to talk about extension options.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so extension mechanics are not a new concept by any means, having been a feature of investment grade and leveraged corporate financings for some time. But we are seeing a growing trend of its use across other areas as well, not least real estate finance transactions. And in the last few months, we've worked on transactions which incorporate extensions with numerous documentary agents, with large syndicates of financial institutions, a number of which are being represented on today's call. So for a number of you, this will be familiar territory. Notwithstanding this, I think it's helpful to set out the basic principle and draw out some key areas that we see as up for negotiation on these deals. So extension mechanics allow for borrowers to push the termination date out beyond the original maturity date without the need to amend the facility agreement. And at the outset of this session, I outlined some of the obstacles to extensions in a facility without that extension optionality drafted in at the outset. So where the extension is quite clearly a feature of the deal, the documents need not be reopened, which avoids the need for the agent to consider the lender consent thresholds that might be applicable and the costs and timetables relating to amending the facility agreement. The security need not be retaken. And as the extension is very much within the purview of the guarantee at the time the guarantor signed up to the transaction, even guarantee confirmations would be considered unnecessary in most cases. So what about the kind of structure that we see of these extensions? Well, typically we see 3+1+1 structures, or sometimes, but slightly less frequently, 5+1+1 structures, whereby initial 3 or 5 year facilities are subject to 2 separate 1-year extensions. There are, of course, exceptions. We've recently worked on shorter facilities which are subject to a single 12-month extension. And more unusually, we've also recently acted for a lender on a single-year facility, which had an option to extend for an unspecified time yet to be agreed. So almost exclusively, the facilities we see in the market provide for absolute lender discretion in whether to agree to the extension. This is perhaps no surprise, as the borrower has locked in a committed facility for a shorter time period, and the lenders aren't prepared to consider signing up and committing to in any form to longer facilities without the requisite controls to be able to do so. And the upside of this is that absolute lender discretion eliminates the need for the parties to enter into lengthy negotiations and no little crystal ball gazing about what conditionality the lender may need to attach to any pre-baked consent to the extension at the outset of the transaction. So on this slide is a fairly basic and unfortunately slightly small, if anyone's joining on their smartphone, representation of a typical extension timeline. And I'll be leaving this slide up for a little while as it helps to frame some of the points that I want to talk about. The first thing you'll note is that although the loan has an initial tenor of 3 years, the first extension request, which is the green dot, must be made prior to the first anniversary of the date of the facility agreement, which is shown by the red dot. So on some financings, a borrower may want to make the decision about exercising an extension option much closer to the termination date, which is shown by the pale pink dot later along in the line. But where they have a clearer view perhaps of the market and whether it would be in fact preferable at that time to refinance altogether rather than extend on their existing terms. And in the past, that probably was the common approach, but there are downsides for the borrower if it's waiting for lenders to decide whether or not to extend as the maturity date looms, as it could be left needing to refinance at very short notice if the lenders reject any extension request at that time. So over the years, there's therefore been a trend to require that any such extension is locked in much, much earlier, typically at the first and second anniversaries of the date of the facility agreement. So 1 year into the facility, the borrower may not have significantly better insight into its financing needs and pricing in the market in years 3 and 4. So why would that be helpful? Well, 3-year pricing is cheaper than 5-year pricing, as there's less uncertainty about changes in the market and also changes to business performance. So it enables the borrower to effectively receive that lower pricing over a 5-year period, whilst maintaining a reset 3-year facility. Lenders, on the other hand, use this to attract customers with their pricing and possible longer tenor, without having to provide committed funds for the whole period. And it's an arrangement that tends to suit most parties and has become the market norm. So there's often some negotiation about when the extension request needs to be delivered, but a typical outcome is somewhere between 60 and 30 days before the first or the second anniversary of the facility agreement. So the borrower wants as much certainty as possible and will want as wide a window as possible to be able to deliver that request. And in practice, lenders are fairly accommodating, and a window of a month is not uncommon at all. The lenders would then have a period of, in this scenario, up to 30 days or so to accept or reject the request, which when taken all together ensures that the extension takes effect before or at the relevant anniversary of the facility agreement, or is rejected as the case may be by that time. The lenders will only want to agree to an extension if they're comfortable that no default is continuing and that all the repeating representations and warranties are correct in all material respects as at the date of the extension request, but also as at the date that the extension takes effect. And there can be some pushback and negotiation on this latter point, as borrowers may say they shouldn't have to repeat the reps again at the time the lenders accept the extension notice if they've done so when making the request in the first place. I think in practice, we rarely see this successfully negotiated, as a bank would want to be able to revoke the extension in the event a default came to light between the date of an extension request and the acceptance date. So if all the lenders accept the extension request and there's no default continuing and all the repeating representations are correct in all material respects, then usually the extension becomes effective immediately. Or if a fee is payable or the lenders have set some sort of conditionality about the extension taking place, then at the time that fee is paid or those specific conditions have been met by the borrower. Whether those fees are agreed up front or are agreed in a fee letter at the time tends to vary, although in recent transactions we've worked on, the latter appears to be the growing trend. What happens if all the lenders reject the first extension? Well, I think the outcome there is fairly obvious. The termination date simply stays the same. And the usual position is that that wouldn't preclude the borrower from making a second extension request on the second anniversary of the date of the facility agreement. And on most facilities we see, the borrower may at that stage request an extension of a year or a further 2 years if it hasn't already successfully extended, essentially converting the structure from that 3+1 that I mentioned earlier to 3+2. So one might ask, why would a borrower look to extend after the first anniversary when the potential is there for a 2-year extension the following year? I think the key word there is potential. I think it's by no means certain that a lender who might have an appetite to extend in year 1 would necessarily want to extend by 2 years a year later. And the cumulative extensions provide the borrower with certainty as to its continued credit line. So what about the middle ground where some of the lenders reject the extension, but others accept it? Well, it's a slightly more kind of untidy result for the borrower. And there have been different approaches in the market in these circumstances. The default position is simply that the extension only takes effect for those lenders who've accepted the extension request, and the borrower has to repay those who do not on the original termination date in accordance with the original provisions of the facility agreement. And this works for some borrowers. But I think a number see this as a pretty unattractive outcome. Suddenly they have an upcoming mismatch between their facility size and their funding requirements, but are still locked in for that additional year. And for that reason, some borrowers push to include a provision whereby if one or more lenders reject the extension request, then they have the ability and the right to revoke that extension request altogether across the lender group, even if some lenders have already indicated that they're prepared to extend. More unusually, we've also seen facilities where non-extending lenders have been required to facilitate a transfer of their commitments at par to lenders who are prepared to extend. It's essentially incorporating a yank the bank concept into the extension mechanics. So for a very strong borrower, this can then be combined with targeted extension notices. That is, the borrower instructs the agent only to deliver its extension request to specific lenders with a view to repaying the lenders who are not given the chance to extend at the original termination date. And the outcome of this is similar to voluntary prepayment in many ways, save that the prepayment is not applied pro rata across the lenders, but rather prepaying certain lenders in full at the original termination date and others not at all because they've been extended. So the lenders need to really consider at the outset whether they're happy with that as an outcome. And I think lenders and their lawyers have to be very careful when drafting such clauses, that the wording doesn't inadvertently give the borrower the right to yank the bank where the bank in question hasn't been given the chance to extend, which would give the borrower a huge amount of leverage over each of its lending banks throughout the life of the facility, with the threat of ejection from the facility at the first or second anniversary of the facility agreement hanging over each lender. It's not a common feature that comes up in extensions negotiations, but one that we have seen on some financing and is worth just keeping in mind. So I think that's hopefully been a helpful snapshot of facility extensions, and I'll pass over to Adam to speak about the more murky world of structural adjustments.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so you may think that structural adjustment clauses seem quite different from the other mechanisms we've been talking about today. An accordion or an extension option are a key feature of the commercial terms of the deal, whereas this is just like an extra clause that you might have at the back end of a facility agreement as another variable on the lender consent thresholds that Joe talked about at the beginning when the parties are amending a facility. However, it very much falls into the category of provisions that can make it easier for borrowers to increase or extend facilities. And it's relatively sort of low profile is actually a reason why I think it's worth flagging as something that lenders should at least be mindful of. So, what is a structural adjustment clause? Well, the LMA added a structural adjustment clause to its leverage finance facility agreement as optional language back in 2012. And the context at the time was that there was what was referred to as a wall of debt that was building post-financial crisis, with deals that had been signed 2007, 2008 coming up for refinancing, and some existing syndicates having very different appetites to extend existing facilities, either in terms of size or tenor. So particularly in the sponsored market, borrowers were looking to sort of future-proof their new agreements by avoiding a situation where they'd have to do a full refinance if they needed an extension, but couldn't get every syndicate member on board. And that's what the structural adjustment clause is there to do. I mean, it's undoubtedly a borrower-friendly mechanism within the amendments and waivers clause that allows amendments to the structure, the size, or the currency of the facilities that would otherwise require all lender consent under those sort of usual mechanics that Joe talked about at the beginning. So those amendments can potentially be made under this clause, provided the change is approved by each lender that has agreed to participate in whatever the structural amendment is, and a specified proportion of the lenders generally, whether they're participating or not. So that proportion might just be the majority lenders, so it needs majority lenders and participating lenders, or it might be that that consent is required. The consent is required from the super majority lenders, and that's a concept that's sort of unique to this clause and doesn't have the same sort of standardized meaning as majority lenders does, but would typically be 75 to 85% of lenders by commitment. It's got to be somewhere between majority lenders and all lenders to be meaningful. And there may be an option within the clause to mix and match the majority lender and super majority lender consent thresholds, depending on what type of structural adjustment is proposed, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Now, this mechanism predates any widespread use of accordions, incrementals, and extension options. So the market has moved on a bit since this was devised, and to an extent you would think that a borrower would be less likely to push to include this clause, particularly if it's been able to incorporate bespoke incremental or extension options in its agreement. After all, while this clause makes it easier for a borrower to increase or extend than having nothing at all, it still requires the borrower to get at least majority lender consent, whereas the other mechanisms we looked at just require the process to be followed without any specific consents and obviously getting buy-in from the relevant participating parties. And this structural adjustment mechanism, it is still a mechanic to amend the facility terms. So you don't avoid all the process points that Joe talked about at the beginning. Who needs to sign the amendment? What CPs you need? Do you need to retake security? So it hasn't got that streamlining functionality that incrementals and extensions have. But it's still there as optional language in the LMA Leverage Finance Facility Agreement, and one that borrowers in that market still sometimes do look to include, even when they've got some of those other hardwired mechanics we've already talked about. So I think it's worth lenders being aware of this and just keeping an eye out for it. What types of change can be made during this through a structural adjustment clause? Well, it's not set out in a particularly intuitive way within the sort of the LMA drafting, but I've set out on the screen there the sort of the basic types of change that fall within its scope. So you'll see that I've underlined the types of changes that we're focusing on today. So increasing an existing tranche capital T, meaning a facility in this context, creating a new tranche, extending an existing payment date. But it can also cover other types of changes, so increasing the availability period for an RCF, changing the currency of a facility, reducing the margin. And all of these different types of changes are categorized into 3 different types of structural adjustment, and you have major structural adjustment, minor structural adjustment, and payables reductions. The main difference between those and which sort of category that the relevant amendment falls into is that you can impose different consent thresholds for different types of structural amendments. So you might, the agreement might provide that a minor structural adjustment just needs participating lenders and majority lender consent, whereas a major structural adjustment requires participating lenders and supermajority lenders. So this clause can be used for quite a range of changes. I'm just going to focus for a moment on how it can be used to increase the size of the overall facility. And this is referred to in the clause as a facility increase. And that can be whether it's an increase to an existing facility or by the creation of a new tranche, a bit like with an incremental facility. So what kind of increases is the borrower able to sort of push through using these slightly more streamlined amendment mechanics? What the clause says is that any new tranche must rank pari passu or junior to the existing facilities that are covered within the existing facility agreement. And there may be a cap on the size of the pari passu facility increases that can be made under this clause. In other words, without having to get all lender consent. But typically there wouldn't be a cap on increases to junior ranking facility increases. So I guess the question is, how much of it, from a lender perspective, how much of a concern is this for existing lenders? You know, if the borrower is wanting to include this clause and they say, well, nothing can ever rank ahead of you under this clause, it's all fine. Is that actually the case? Well, looking at increases in junior debt first, I think it's important to note that we're not talking about fully subordinated, unsecured, quasi-equity type junior debt here. I think junior debt in this context just means that in insolvency, there would be a turnover obligation on the junior lender so that the senior lender gets out first. So this type of putting this additional debt into the sort of the facility agreement terms does have the potential to add stress to the capital structure. You know, it's going to increase the amount of interest that's payable, and that could be at a higher rate than the existing debt. What about increases in pari passu debt? So they say we'll often have a cap on that, but again, that does have the potential to sort of dilute recoveries of existing lenders, and also again potentially add stress to the structure. And I think this is why lenders do need to consider when they're negotiating deals where this is, you know, maybe being talked about, whether the flexibility that this gives a borrower has the potential to change the deal in ways that, were not considered at the outset, and importantly, may not have been factored into sort of credit committee approvals that the lenders will have obtained at the outset. So this mechanism is never going to force a lender to lend any more money. It's not going to force a lender to extend its loan, but a lender might find that its commitment has become part of a bigger overall facility than was originally anticipated or approved because of the structural adjustment clause. Okay, that all assumes that the facilities in your initial facilities agreement all rank equally, and that's the sort of the usual position. But what if you have a facility agreement that includes say a term loan D, which is a second lien or junior in some other way to the other term facilities, as shown in the diagram there. And I think this is where sort of the real danger lies, in leaving in a sort of the standard structural adjustment clause and not sort of tailoring it to the transaction structure that you've got. The reason for that is that, as I've already mentioned, what the LMA drafting provides is that new tranches cannot be created that rank ahead of existing facilities. And that drafting is being provided in the context that all the facilities rank equally at the outset, and so there's no change to that sort of equal position for any new debt that's going in. But in this sort of slightly more unusual context, where you've got a sort of a facility, a subordinated facility D within the facility agreement, it potentially does bring the option of actually changing the ranking of that because to a pari passu position with the other facilities. Now, I wouldn't want to overstate the alarm bells on this, because this type of change would, at the very least, still require majority lender consent, and it may require supermajority lender consent. But I think it just illustrates the danger of having this clause buried away on page 200 and something of your facility agreement, and in a time pressured closing, it's easy to overlook the fact that this is not just a sort of bit of boilerplate that you can ignore. I think, from a lender perspective, the takeaway points are, it's always going to be preferable to remove the clause. And I think the argument for doing that is pretty strong if you have incremental and extension mechanics in the deal anyway. But if it is included, I think do think about whether you need to revisit the drafting if there's anything unusual about the debt structure, as in this example I've just been through there. Okay, just final point on structural adjustments. I've just set out there as a form of summary some of the key differences between the use of an incremental facility to make it easier for borrowers to increase the facility, and a structural adjustment clause to make it easier for borrowers to do the same thing. And I think what I would I suppose that the key takeaway point from almost all of these is that an incremental facility is probably a better option. It's clear what type of changes in the scope of the deal can happen, which is less the case with the structural adjustment. The facility terms following the use of the mechanism are clear, don't need any new drafting. Lenders are either going to have a right of first refusal on new or increased commitments, or they're going to have negotiated that point and clearly sort of dealt with that point consciously at the beginning of the deal. There are again, whether there should be any limits on facility increase on pricing, that's going to be negotiated at the outset. And just the fact that the incremental facility is a sort of a much more prominent feature means that it's going to be referred to in the original term sheet. It's going to be part of credit committee approvals and so on. And so it's a much more transparent way of dealing with these points than through this, than a structural adjustment clause. I think the one thing that is sort of, I suppose, more on the structural adjustment clause in terms of lender control is the point I've already made, is that the borrower is always going to need at least majority lender consent to be able to do anything under the structural adjustment clause, and that's not the case with incrementals. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the today's session. Does anybody have any questions for Joe and I before we wrap up? Okay, I've had a question here, which is what's the typical number of times that an accordion can be exercised over the course of a facility? I think that does vary a bit, but I would say that 3 is quite a common number for that. Okay, we've not had any other questions, so thank you for participating in and joining the meeting today. I hope that you found it useful, and we will be starting the fundamentals program up again after the summer break, so do look out for calendar for invitations to the sessions that we'll be running in the second part of this year. Thanks very much.